Weather became the V-1's silent adversary. Strong crosswinds degraded the mechanical autopilot's accuracy, high humidity interfered with the chemical reaction in the launch catapult, and heavy rain made it difficult for the pulse jet to reach stable combustion. Many launch cycles had to be halted entirely when humidity exceeded operational limits. This forced Germany to position launch sites as close to the coastline as possible, where winds were steady and the air drier. The launch process functioned like an industrial assembly line. A V-1 airframe was taken from storage, fitted with its warhead, fueled with gasoline, charged with compressed air, had its autopilot calibrated using paper maps, and was then mounted onto the piston of the Walter catapult. Once the pulse jet was ignited and reached stable resonance, the safety pin was pulled, the piston shot down the rail, bringing the V-1 to launch speed in seconds. From that moment on, the flying bomb was entirely independent of human control. The most striking aspect of V-1 logistics was its distributed manufacturing capability. The steel fuselage could be welded in small factories, the wooden wings made by local carpentry workshops, the autopilot assembled in precision mechanical facilities, and the pulse jet put together in underground camps using forced labor. This allowed Germany to maintain production even as major industrial cities like Hamburg and Essen were devastated by bombing. The trade-off was inconsistency. Many Von Second crashed immediately after launch due to substandard components or miscalibrated autopilots. Even so, the operational cost of the V-1 remained extraordinarily low compared to every other long-range weapon Germany possessed. A single bomber sortie required thousands of liters of fuel and carried a high risk of losing irreplaceable crew assets Germany no longer had. By contrast, a V-1 launch site could fire dozens of missiles per day with minimal combat personnel. In a collapsing industrial environment, this was the only long-range capability Germany could sustain. When the Allies captured the French launch zones, V-1 attacks did not cease entirely. Germany shifted to air-launching Von Second from Heinkel He-111 bombers at high altitude, giving the flying bombs greater range and bypassing most British ground defenses. Although less effective and far riskier, He-111 seconds were easy targets for Allied fighters. This adaptation demonstrated Germany's determination to maintain long-range strike capability at all costs. In terms of deployment, the V-1 was not merely a flying bomb. It was an entire system, one whose strategic value came not from accuracy, but from its ability to operate under the worst conditions, to scale from centralized construction to dispersed firing, and to remain effective through sheer volume. And it was this system, more than the bomb itself, that forced Britain and the United States to rethink their entire defensive doctrine. When the first V-1 slammed into London at dawn, on the 13th of June 1944, the British public immediately understood that an entirely new phase of the war had begun. No bomber formations drifting over the city lights, no distant rumble of Rolls-Royce Merlin engines warning of incoming raids, and no time to rush into shelters. The V-1 arrived in the simplest yet most terrifying way imaginable. A steady, droning pulse jet buzz, a sudden cutting of the sound, and then an explosion tearing a neighborhood apart. That simplicity is what made the V-1 so distinct. These flying bombs offered no warning, required no coordinated squadron, were not limited by high-altitude weather, and had no return course. Within weeks, London's rhythm of life was overturned. Every day, more than 100 volts, 1 second, across the English Channel, forcing the British Air Defense Network to commit every available radar unit, anti-aircraft battery, and fighter squadron to intercept them. Yet even when intercepted, the impact of the V-1 rippled far beyond the point of explosion. One missile that struck Kennington flattened an entire row of houses. Another hit a crowded railway station, creating chaos that survivors described as a train detonating in the heart of the city. The near vertical dive of a V, one after its pulse jet shut off, concentrated the blast into a tight footprint, unlike wide carpet bomb patterns, producing deep, localized destruction in London's narrow neighborhoods. The first effect of the V-1 was physical, destroying infrastructure, killing civilians, disrupting transportation and essential services. But the second effect, and arguably the more powerful one, was psychological. Every Londoner learned the rule. As long as you heard the buzzing, you were safe. When it stopped, you had seconds to live. No other weapon in World War II created this strange cycle of tension. Fear came not from the number of casualties, but from absolute unpredictability. For the British military, the V-1 posed a tactical challenge with no precedent. Traditional air defenses optimized for high-altitude bombers were nearly useless at first. Britain had to reconfigure its entire air defense doctrine into a multi-layered system called Operation Diver, early warning radar along the coast, high-speed interceptors in the middle tier, and finally radar-directed SCR-584 anti-aircraft guns using proximity-fused shells. It was an integrated defensive network more complex than anything previously built, and all to counter a cheap, unmanned flying bomb. Even so, the V-1 exposed its limitations. Large trajectory errors meant many bombs fell in rural areas instead of London. The pulse jet faltered in humid or windy conditions. Numerous V-2 crashed immediately after launch due to autopilot faults or inconsistent component quality. And as Operation Diver improved, the interception rate climbed sharply, especially once tempests and meteors learned the predictable low, straight flight path of the weapon. A turning point came when Allied forces captured the launch sites in France. From that moment, the only remaining attack method was air-launching V-2 from Heinkel He-111 bombers. This extended the campaign by several months, but effectiveness dropped dramatically. The He-111 had to approach Allied airspace and were often shot down before deploying their missiles. What is notable is that even as the V-1's effectiveness declined, it continued to force Britain and the United States to divert strategic resources. Many bombing missions originally intended to support the Normandy offensive were redirected to destroy V-1 launch sites and storage depots. This did not change the outcome of the war, but it slowed Allied operational momentum and added pressure to decision-making at the highest levels. From the perspective of British pilots and gunners, the V-1 produced two contradictory emotions. On one hand, they viewed it as a coward's weapon, a bomb that required no skill, flew straight, and offered no dogfight challenge. On the other hand, they privately respected the ingenuity of Germany's autonomous design. Intercepting a V-1 was exhausting, dangerous, and nerve-wracking. Pilots had to chase a high-speed object knowing that if they fired too close, the explosion could kill them as well. The battlefield effectiveness of the V-1 therefore cannot be measured only by buildings destroyed or casualties inflicted, but by the defensive cost it imposed. To stop a simple mechanical device with no electronics, Britain had to rebuild its entire air defense system, divert thousands of personnel and weapons from other fronts, and invest in new radar, artillery, and fighter technologies. The cost of interception was vastly greater than the cost for Germany to produce and launch another V-1. The V-1 never reversed the course of World War II, but it forced the enemy to expend resources far greater than its own intrinsic value. And that is the kind of effectiveness strategists understand best. In a war of attrition, a weapon does not need to win battles. It only needs to make the enemy pay more than they planned. The V-1 never had the power to change the outcome of World War II, but it introduced a form of strategic pressure Germany had never possessed before: the ability to conduct long-range strikes without relying on air superiority. At a moment when the Luftwaffe could no longer send bomber formations into British airspace, the V-1 became Germany's only means of maintaining offensive depth against enemy territory. And it was this capability that forced Britain, the United States, and the entire Allied strategic apparatus to shift multiple priorities at once. The first impact of the V-1 was the reallocation of defensive resources. Within the first 3 months of the campaign, Britain was forced to divert more than a quarter of its heavy anti-aircraft batteries away from industrial centers, ports, and critical production zones, reassembling them into the diver belt along the southern coast. Thousands of gunners, dozens of Tempest, Spitfire, and Mosquito squadrons, and the most advanced SCR-584 radar networks were pulled away from missions supporting the European ground campaign. A cheap, straight-flying, pilotless bomb absorbed defensive assets that Britain had spent the entire early war building. The second impact was a doctrinal shift in air defense. Before the V-1, British air defenses were structured to counter high-altitude heavy bombers, tight Heinkel and Junkers formations entering at 5,000 meters. Radar, guns, and fighters were all oriented around this model. But the V-1 flew low, relatively fast, small, and non-maneuvering. It shattered the strategic assumptions of pre-war planning. To counter it, Britain had to build a truly multi-layered defensive architecture, early detection, mid-altitude interception, and low-altitude anti-aircraft engagement. This became the first practical template for the layered air defense doctrine that would later define counter-cruise missile operations for decades. The third impact was the strategic diversion of Allied offensive power. When 150 volts, 1 second began falling on London each day, Allied command shifted numerous bombing missions away from Normandy's support to attack launch sites across Pas-de-Calais. The shift did not change the outcome of the campaign, but it slowed the pace of the offensive, extended logistical strains, and forced the United States and Britain to recalibrate operational priorities. A weapon that could not maneuver, could not adjust course, and was not even accurate still compelled two industrial superpowers to temporarily delay parts of their master plan. The fourth and deeper impact was the reshaping of long-range strike philosophy. The V-1 demonstrated three principles that would influence global weapons development for the next 80 years. An autonomous weapon, even without a pilot, can have strategic effect. A cheap, mass-producible platform launched in saturation can outperform a smaller number of sophisticated systems. Defensive costs will almost always exceed offensive costs when facing low-cost autonomous weapons. These principles drove the United States to reverse engineer the V-1 into the JB-2 Loon, tested from submarines, surface ships, and aircraft. The Soviet Union soon followed with its own long-range cruise missile lineage. The V-1's philosophy, low-altitude flight, long-range autonomy, and low cost, became the foundation for later systems such as the Tomahawk KH-55, Storm Shadow, and AGM-86. From a strategic perspective, the V-1 became a tool of sustained pressure for a nation in collapse. It allowed Germany to continue disrupting Britain's home front even after the Luftwaffe had crumbled. It bought time, complicated Allied decision-making, and forced dispersion of Allied strength. In limited form, it became a type of strategic lever that a weaker nation rarely possesses in high-intensity industrial warfare, but its limits were equally clear. The V-1 lacked the accuracy to hit hardened military targets, lacked the speed to survive once the enemy adapted, and lacked the influence to alter the battlefield as German ground forces deteriorated on every front from Normandy to the Eastern Front. When Allied forces seized the launch sites in France, the V-1 campaign ended almost immediately, and Germany had no alternative system that was both affordable and resilient enough to maintain pressure. Yet the historical value of the V-1 does not lie in what happened in 1944. It lies in the question it forced the world to confront in an era where cheap, autonomous weapons can be launched in swarms. Can any nation sustain defense solely through expensive, complex systems? That question continues to shape NATO, US, Russian, Chinese, and Ukrainian force planning today. The V-1 did not change the outcome of World War II, but it changed the direction of global military thinking. And in modern warfare, ideas often shape the balance of power far more enduringly than any single battle. Even before the war ended, German engineers were already trying to push the V-1 beyond its original limits. They attempted extended-range versions, improved autopilot systems, and even the Reichenberg, a manned suicide attack variant that captured perfectly the desperation of Germany in 1944, a nation drained of all resources but still clinging to the ability to strike at long range by any means available. None of these variants reached operational use, but they revealed a shift in German thinking, a transition toward an era where humans were no longer the centerpiece of every offensive platform. After 1945, the V-1's future no longer lay in the weapon itself, but in the philosophy it pioneered. The United States captured hundreds of V-1 units, examined each servo mechanism and autopilot component, and then built a near-identical copy, the JB-2 Loon. It was tested from submarines, surface ships, bombers, and coastal batteries, the very launch concepts that later shaped Tomahawk and AGM-86 deployment doctrine. The Soviet Union did the same, studying the V-1's low-altitude flight characteristics to develop its first ship and air-launched cruise missiles. From these crude foundations, the world moved toward the systems that define modern warfare. Tomahawk, Ka-55, Storm Shadow, Popeye Turbo, CJ-10, each carrying the genetic imprint of the V-1's basic formula: low-flying, autonomous, long-range, low-personnel, cost attack. In the next 15 years, cruise missile technology will continue along the trajectory the V-1 laid down, except now with exponential sophistication. Digital inertial navigation, military-grade GPS, infrared seekers, active radar homing, and terrain matching will bring accuracy down to meters rather than kilometers. Lightweight composite materials, stealth shaping, and high-efficiency turbofans allow weapons to travel thousands of kilometers, evade radar, and destroy bunkers or command centers with precision. But one principle remains unchanged. In a battle space where the enemy controls the skies, a nation can still strike deep without risking aircrew. This is the V-1's most enduring legacy. Technically speaking, the V-1 is obsolete today. Its pulse jet is too noisy, its mechanical autopilot too crude, its speed too slow, and its launch method too exposed. But in military thinking, the V-1 has never been obsolete. It was the first lesson in the asymmetric economics of offense and defense. One side needs only a cheap flying bomb. The other must deploy radar networks, fighters, anti-aircraft batteries, and unified command and control systems. That exchange ratio remains at the heart of every low-cost, long-range strike system of the 21st century, from loitering munitions and kamikaze drones to slow-flying cruise missiles. Looking back at the entire campaign, the V-1 possessed four strengths that no late-war German weapon could replicate. It was cheap enough to be mass-produced by the tens of thousands even under bombardment. It was simple enough to build in dispersed underground workshops. It was autonomous enough to replace pilots, one of Germany's scarcest resources, and its warhead was powerful enough to impose strategic pressure on Britain without requiring high accuracy. But it also carried three fatal weaknesses that prevented it from altering the war's outcome. Its large targeting error made it useless against hardened military objectives. It became increasingly vulnerable once defenses adapted, and it lacked the influence to shape the ground war, where the Wehrmacht was collapsing on every front. Once the Allies destroyed the launch sites in France, the V-1 lost most of its power within days, a clear demonstration of the limits of a weapon dependent on fixed firing infrastructure. Yet the V-1's legacy extends far beyond the victories and losses of 1944. In every major military academy in the world, any discussion of unmanned long-range strike systems begins with the V-1. It stands as the first proof that a nation losing control of the air can still apply strategic pressure through low-cost autonomous systems, and it serves as a warning for the 21st century. In a world of kamikaze UAVs, low-cost cruise missiles, and swarm attack platforms, the cost of defense may always exceed the cost of attack. If the entire value of the V-1 must be captured in a single sentence, it is this: the V-1 was the first weapon to prove that in modern warfare, the most frightening capability is not accuracy or speed, but the ability to launch mass autonomous attacks cheaply, forcing the enemy to pay exponentially more to defend. And from the moment those first Von seconds swept across the English Channel, the world entered the age of the cruise missile, an age that every major power is still living under today.